I was a holy terror to my teachers. Um, I have a second grade report card with a note from a teacher that said, David annoys other children. He needs to be more concerned with his own problems. And I'm pretty sure that was the year I peaked in school. In junior high, we had a vice principal who was in charge of discipline. So he got to know me pretty well. He was a Marine or something, and he primarily focused on projecting fear. He was in charge of corporal punishment. Yeah, corporal, I got that right. He had a collection of paddles on his wall, different shapes and sizes. And like one had holes cut in it so he could swing it faster. But his favorite paddle was a black leather paddle with shiny steel spikes. And while he was yelling at you for talking or stepping out of line in a hallway or whatever, he would reach down into his desk and pull out the paddle and just flip it in his hands while he yelled at you. Then he'd tell you to go over and bend over a desk facing away from him. So the whole time you're thinking he's going to paddle you with the black leather paddle, but he'd swap it out for the regular one. He was a master of psychological warfare on 11-year-olds. Some grades, I think I spent more of my time in the office than I did in class. That's not true, but it felt that way. I was very friendly with the ladies in the office, and I would sit there and be very quiet and listen to who was coming back from lunch smelling like beer and the speculation on which teachers were fooling around. It was a lot more interesting than class in that way. And that's why I was in the office on the morning of March 28th, 1979. I was thrown out of class early that day. And that day started with phones lighting up and a flurry of phone calls and lots of parents calling to get their kids out of school. And then one of the office ladies took a call from an out-of-town relative, and then there was a lot of whispering, and then a lady started making personal phone calls to find out if what they had heard was true. Years later, a guy I worked with in radio told me he just happened to have the phone number of the control room at 3 Mile Island. And he called the guy and said, hey, what's going on? And the guy said, can't talk, big problem, and hung up. But to prevent panic, we were in a news blackout, basically. The word was leaking out, but people were starting to panic. I remember there was a woman came into the school office yelling, I want my son. I want my son right now. Where is my son? And one of the office ladies was like, okay, who is your son, ma'am? She responded, don't give me that. You can't keep my son. You can't keep my son from me. I want my son here right now. And it took about 2 minutes of trying to get this woman to calm down and tell them her son's name so they could call him to the office. And you know what's really scary to a kid? Seeing an adult completely lose their shit. I mean, it's 42 years later, and I could still see this woman in my mind. I mean, she looked like she'd normally be at the country club for the Lions Club Ladies Auxiliary Luncheon that day, you know? I mean, it looked like she was born with a swept-up bob wearing pearls and something tasteful from Chanel. And to see her completely out of control, someone who left rational thought behind and was screaming at this high school office lady was terrifying. It was like an invasion of the body snatchers moment. And then other parents started rolling in and trying to get their kids out of school so they could make a run for it. And they say that civilization is a thin veneer over the brutish nature of mankind. I looked that quote up, and a lot of different people claim it, so I will too. But that's basically what I saw that day. In the face of being annihilated by a nuclear meltdown, Karen from the PTA was seconds away from picking up a weapon and killing an office worker who was keeping her kid from leaving high school. And that was just the beginning of my relationship with 3 Mile Island. One of my first jobs in radio was to go to the hearings that they held on the accident and record them for a local radio station. And I'd go to the things and I'd actually listen and become more frightened. People would introduce evidence about things like fake x-rays of welds. Do you know why they x-ray the welds? Because they have to be perfect. And do you know why they have to be perfect? Because once they go into the plant, you can't go in and fix them. So they x-ray them. But the construction crews are incentivized to work very, very fast because it's expensive to build these things. And the faster they get it online, the faster they start making money back. So sometimes when you get a bad weld, you just take a picture of a different weld and change the numbers. The guys who built these things aren't from the area. They're not staying, so they don't care. And at these hearings, people would produce weld x-rays that were identical and perfect. And that's just not possible because they were faked. But because faulty welds were not a direct cause of the accident, they weren't admitted into evidence, even though the owners were petitioning to allow the plant to go back online with those faulty welds. Years later, I was working on a documentary at a nuclear power plant, and that's when I found out what they do with the nuclear waste. Waste that's going to be deadly for 20,000 years. There was one solution at one time. It was to transport all of the waste all the way across the country, since most of the plants are in the east, and bury it in a mountain in New Mexico. Now, they can't do that for a number of reasons now, depending on who you talk to. They shut down the mountain. So now they just let it all pile up in temporary storage around the plant. Doesn't that sound like a great idea? It's now 42 years later and the plant is closed and people are saying, well, what's the big deal? Nothing happened. Well, I know 4 people, including myself, who have had leukemia. And I know people who were also within the 5 mile ring that day who've had other cancers. And I know that that's anecdotal. That's not proof of anything. So I asked people who are in medical research, and they just laughed at me. You can't prove that something that happened 40 years ago has a cause and effect relationship with anything. And who's going to pay for a 40-year study? And with mobile populations, how do you show a cluster effect? So there's no way to prove that anything affected anything. It only takes 2 damaged chromosomes to cause leukemia. But since it didn't happen to everyone, you can't prove anything. So when people ask me why I'm so opposed to nuclear power, particularly now that it's being offered as a solution to climate change, I have to admit that it's personal. It tried to kill my family. It tried to kill me. I'm old enough to remember when they used to say, nuclear power never killed anyone. And then Chernobyl happened and they started saying, nuclear power never killed anyone in America. But look, if we're not very, very, very careful, it can kill us all. What was the last thing you remember us being very, very, very careful about? I mean, this is a country that just half the people just lost their shit about having to wear masks. And in the end, it always reminds me of one of those colorful phrases I picked up over the years. It's a lot like taking a dump in your closet in the middle of a cold, dark night. It might seem like a good idea at the time, but eventually, it's going to stink.